are very glad to have Fay Horwitt with us. She serves as the president of Forward Cities. She oversees organizational strategy and serves as the executive lead of the eShip Communities Initiative for them. In addition, Fay is a dedicated advocate for the emerging profession of ecosystem building and as a founding member of Ecosystems Unite. Beyond her former roles, she is a sought-after presenter and trainer, thought leader on the topic of equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem building. Never one to be content with status quo, Fay has also began addressing a new need in local communities, the ecosystem healing. Very important right now is we are very interested in how ecosystems can pivot to deal with the dual COVID-19 and systemic racial injustice pandemics. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome Fay. And Fay, we're going to give you some time to present and then come back and do some Q&A. So again, I want to encourage people to drop questions into the chat and we'll continue the discussion interactively in a few minutes.
So great to be with you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to share with you all today. Again, as Greg said, my name is Fay Horwitt. I am the president and CEO of a national nonprofit called Forward Cities. And I'll tell you a little bit about Forward Cities in a little bit, but I'm just excited. We're going to have a conversation today, which is really timely based on where we are in our society right now, and that is about equity for every entrepreneur. Forward Cities was founded in 2014. We are a national nonprofit that equips communities and regions and leaders to grow and sustain more equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. So folks like you who are in the room today, that is who we serve. We don't directly serve entrepreneurs. We help you be able to equip yourselves to better serve entrepreneurs with an equity lens. And so just to share a little bit more about me, rather than giving you my role, which you already know, I'd like to share with you a little bit about my background, how I got here. And so I was an entrepreneur for quite a while. I was born feeling like I was an entrepreneur, always trying to solve problems. I tripped into entrepreneurial support because I realized as I was going through my journey that there were things and help I wasn't receiving that I wanted to make sure my colleagues and friends who are attempting to launch and grow their own businesses had. And so from there, as I began to see the dynamic in entrepreneurial support, it became clear to me that there were some connections missing between the dots. And I learned about the work of ecosystem building, entrepreneurial ecosystem building, and jumped into that work, head first, and it's been quite an adventure. But since then, I also realized in doing that beyond the local level, doing that on a national level, that there were some systemic issues related to the way ecosystems function that actually required something deeper than just connecting the dots. It required us really digging in and look at some of those issues, particularly from a racial equity standpoint, and think about and discuss how we can heal some of those fractures in a way that can help us more effectively serve entrepreneurs. And that's the work that Forward Cities does. Whenever I'm in a room like this, particularly where I can't see everyone, I wish we were near the beach together, but because we're virtual, I would love to know something about you. If you will, I'll be asking you a few questions today. If you can take out your phone or your computer and go to slido.com and enter in code hashtag 592889, you'll be able to respond to a few questions, and that way we can have a conversation together rather than this being one way. So if you'll jump in there, tell me a little bit about yourself. What is your current role in the entrepreneurial landscape? What does that look like? If there's multiple, feel free to pick multiple. We would just love to see, there we go, we got answers coming in. A lot of ecosystem builders, educators, as I had figured, great. Researchers, fantastic. Love that more of you are really digging into the hows and the data related to this work. Fantastic. And you can keep entering those in, but I just wanted to get a sense for who we had in the room. And often I think it's really important when we're in community, and this is community, that we speak to each other. So with that, I'll move forward with a presentation. And one of the things we're going to really dig into today, and it's a bit fractal, because this is also the work that Forward Cities does, but this is what we're going to do in this session today. And we're going to catalyze narrative change. And so over the course of this presentation, one of the things we're going to be doing is talking with you about how Forward Cities has gone about developing a new framework, which we call E3 Community. And in our progress to developing that new framework, these are the things that we did, and these are the things we actively do in community. So narrative change is it's not about storytelling, it's beyond that. It's about how do we change the patterns in our society and our culture from a narrative standpoint so that we can create long-term systems change. And I'd like to think about narrative change in these 3 buckets: listen and articulate, analyze and reframe, and then model and equip. And so that's the journey we're going to be on today in this presentation as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat, and Greg will raise those at the end. So our vision as Forward Cities is that every entrepreneur would have equitable opportunity and access to develop, launch, and grow a business that creates wealth for themselves, their family, and/or their community. So it really is tied, entrepreneurship directly tied to economic development and generational wealth building. Forward Cities works across the country. We work with major partners like the Kauffman Foundation, JP Morgan Chase, and most recently, we're engaging in the Navigator pilot program with the SBA. We've worked in over 30 communities around the country to help build more equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. And in doing that, one of the things we've begun to really figure out is that it wasn't enough to just do the work. We had to begin to really pay attention and listen to what we were seeing, what we're experiencing, to understand how we could better shape the work and lean into continuous improvement. And so what I'm going to share with you now is what we've seen, what we've learned, and what I've learned in my time at Forward Cities. In that process is we've discovered that there's a ton of wonderful assets in these ecosystems. There's a genuine care for entrepreneurs. There's folks that are recognizing and naming challenges in real time. There's a willingness to have the tough conversations about the things that emerge. We've seen quite a bit of strong leadership from BIPOC and women leaders who are leading and stepping out and being a true catalyst for their demographic that they serve and beyond. We've seen a resilience and adaptability, particularly in the face of COVID-19. And there's a lot of available real estate and property. And obviously now, with this change and shift in workforce related to the pandemic, there's even more empty and available property. And then we're also seeing a strong uptick in ESO tech adoption over the last couple of years, particularly in relation to COVID-19 as a way to respond to the needs of entrepreneurs at a distance. So these are things we've been seeing quite clearly over the last couple of years in terms of ecosystem assets at a national level. And along the way, what we also did is there's asset mapping because we really want to take an asset-based approach. So we start with that, when we start with authentic conversations about, what is going right and what does an ecosystem have to give. But then we also want to identify the obstacles. It's really important to understand, you got to know what's happening before you can change it. And so you have to have a baseline in which to grow. We do that in a few different ways. Well, we have developed an entrepreneur survey that we deploy in communities and that our research team analyzes. We also have, along with that, an entrepreneurial support organization. So whereas the entrepreneur survey focuses on the perceptions, experience, and attitudes of entrepreneurs, the ESO survey focuses on how ESOs are serving, how they are connected to other ESOs in the ecosystem, how they are collaborating or not, and how aware they are of all the resources in the ecosystem. And then lastly, we do, at that ecosystem level, we do an assessment that we call our E3 Scorecard. We do site visits and we do convenings that bring together entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial support organizations to have conversations about these things, like a focus group, so we can better and more deeply understand that at a relational level, and in spaces where people feel comfortable sharing. Because some people, particularly from underrepresented communities, have been surveyed to death, and they are sick of taking surveys. And so we want to provide other opportunities for them to do that. So over the course of that time, and this is by no means a comprehensive list, but in identifying obstacles, these are some that came up. And you'll see they run the gamut of, these are about resources, we've got product market fit, we've got things related to a lot of issues related to trust. And these are things that you're not going to hear and see typically in real time in your interactions with entrepreneurs. They're not going to say, I don't trust you. But they'll be able to share that in settings that Forward Cities has been able to engage in, which is a tremendous value for organizations. And so you'll see here, there's a lot of things about capital, access, resource availability, disconnection. You'll see some of these words coming up again and again that are about where are the disconnects between entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial support providers and institutional leaders. You'll see these repeating patterns over and over again. And as we looked at these barriers, what we began to see over the last couple of years is they tend to fit into these three buckets. They have to do with one, the entrepreneur, which is, okay, what are the things that the entrepreneur has control over that they can sort of change by themselves, or if they get help, they can change and address. The third level is this idea of the equippers, and that's entrepreneurial support providers and champions. These are all the people that feed the ecosystem. These are issues related to their capacity to serve entrepreneurs, their cultural competence, how they might be able to make improvements and adjustments, particularly with an equity lens to better serve underrepresented and underestimated entrepreneurs. And then this ecosystem level, which really hasn't been talked about up until the last few years, but this is crucial. And that means that these are the things between the entrepreneurs and the equippers. These are the things that exist in the gray area that nobody ever talks about or wants to talk about typically. And you'll see there's issues we're here related to trust and disconnection, geographic challenges, how things are flowing in a value chain. We're talking about commercial corridors, systemic misprofiling. These are things that actually have to happen at the ecosystem level. And most importantly, this is how is that ecosystem connected? How are the players acting in a cohesive and collaborative way? And so this is what we've been hearing and seeing, as we've been listening across ecosystems around the country. And as I move forward, I think it would be great for everyone in the room to be able to understand, based on the role that you sit in, where do you experience and witness that things are working most effectively, right? Where is healthy? So I want you to sort of rank these, with number one being the healthiest in your landscape, whether you serve on a national level or a local level. Let's see what folks have to say. All right, so what's working best? Entrepreneurs. You think our entrepreneurs have what they need to be successful. That's great. It's great to see. Awesome, great to see. Equippers coming in second, ecosystem coming in last. All right. Now, what I'm going to share with you about this, this is actually what we tend to hear and see. It's in line with what we tend to hear and see. And that is folks that serve entrepreneurs tend to think that entrepreneurs have what they need, that they're resourced in a proper way, particularly BIPOC entrepreneurs. And they actually have the opposite experience. And so their perception is not only do they not have the things that they need, but they don't have them in large part because the equippers are not providing them access to those things in an equitable way. And so there's where the crux of the understanding and the connection needs to happen. That's where the growth opportunity is. And that's what the work that we are excited we get to lean into as an organization, which we're going to talk about today. So given that we have now listened to our ecosystem, we've understood what they're needing and what we're seeing, we articulate articulating that, and I've shared that with you. We then went into a sort of a sense where we had to figure out, how do we make sense of this, and how do we reframe the conversation? How do we begin to design differently and create something that can address what we're hearing? And so we, over the last few years, have developed an approach called E3, the E3 approach, and that is a focus on catalyzing equitable entrepreneurial ecosystems. And that looks like, what are all the levers? What are the things that you need to activate and catalyze and support to build an equitable entrepreneurial ecosystem, which we call an E3 community, individually or multiple across the country. And we believe that we can scale this because of sharing of best practices and scaling that at a national level, which we call E3 Nation. And so the foundations of our approach are on 3 tools that we use. One called Abide, and that is an anti-racism framework for entrepreneurial ecosystems. The second is our E3 Scorecard, which helps to analyze the health and equity of the ecosystem from a perception lens. And then third is a relational framework for how we can rethink funding within the ecosystem, how the money flows. And so from an Abide perspective, what the things that we encourage communities to think about is access. Are the opportunities reasonably within reach? Belonging. Do the opportunities and things within the ecosystem resonate with a variety of cultures and lifestyles? From an inclusion perspective, are multiple perspectives integrated in leadership, design, implementation, and promotion? From a diversity lens, is there an intentional openness and outreach to all, not just saying it, because diversity doesn't happen by accident. You actually have to be intentional. And then from an equity lens, it's not enough to just be able to say, everything is equal, because we know, because of systemic oppression and our history, that we actually need to do more to balance the scales. And so this equity piece, along with the belonging piece, are 2 that very rarely get talked about. And one of the things we think about in this belonging piece is this idea that it's not all about asking people to come to you and for you to figure out how to be more inclusive and have more people of color and or women in your spaces or your programs. Sometimes you need to understand that it's okay from a cultural perspective if there are demographic specific programs and resources, and that often entrepreneurs feel more comfortable, feel more trust, and thus can actually have more success in those settings. And that is okay. Not only is okay, but we should support and encourage that and fund that at an equitable level. And that ties into equity. And so you'll see a lot of these things actually tie to one another, and they're holistic. And then lastly, how do the pandemic and its effects, how have they been exacerbating bias, barriers, and bureaucracy that already exist for BIPOC and women entrepreneurs, and it's just been making it worse over the last couple of years. So we share that framework with the communities that we work with, and one of the tools that we sort of lean into related to that Abide framework is this idea that obstacles for entrepreneurs and for economic development tend to fit in these 3 categories, and they're from internal to external. We're operating on personal bias, all of us are, and it informs how we show up and in the ecosystem and how we engage with entrepreneurs. At an organizational level, there are barriers that all are controllable. What are the choices that organizations can make to identify and remove obstacles, whether they be emotional, financial, geographic, educational, that prevent or limit opportunity or access for entrepreneurs? And then there's this piece that can only happen at an institutional systemic level. And that is processes, systems, or practices that make people jump through a lot of hoops to follow rules that are inflexible. And one of the examples is the way the first round of PPP rolled out and how it didn't reach the entrepreneurs and the businesses that most needed it. And so what we provide to ecosystems, this is something we have learned by listening and beginning to analyze a tool, a decision-making matrix that allows them to think about what they can do, what an individual, an organization, or a system can do to begin to make tangible change related to, in particular, in this case, leaning into anti-racist practices. And so this what we hear all the time is people say, and we know this is a problem, but what can we do? And this is a fantastic tool that we've been developing that actually allows, and we were just doing it, it was happening by accident as we were sort of leaning in communities. And now we're getting to the place where we can articulate and recommend some of these actions and that folks use this matrix. So one of the things that we'll also share here is one of our foundational tools is thinking about ecosystem building skills. And so ecosystem building can be either a profession for a few folks, but more likely it's a practice. And there are five or six ecosystem building skills that we think are crucial. One is assessment. How do you conduct qualitative, quantitative, and perception-based research? A lot of researchers in the room to map the efficacy and flow of resources to support entrepreneurs. And then based on what you understand from that data, convening leaders to sense make, define roles, align efforts, identify shared outcomes, and commit to improving them together. Next is action. It's not enough just to create a plan and sit it on a shelf. You've got to actually do something. So we have tools and processes to help entrepreneurs be able to ideate together, to co-design, to test, to pilot things. That is how you build trust between partners in an ecosystem and how you get things moving forward. And then advocacy, pushing for better policies, practices across the ecosystem to make sure resources are directed to those that need them most. And lastly, amplification. How are we telling the story and how are we shifting the narrative in a considerable way so that more folks are engaged in this work and that understand the challenges and or what they can do to solve them. And lastly, what we see is across all of these, and this is hugely important. This is something that comes up all the time, is that there's this asset mapping piece. And rather than sort of ticking boxes, it's not about we have this, we don't have this. It's about building authentic relationships along the way of all of these skills. Listening, being intentional about building relationships that can further this work. And this is the most crucial piece of ecosystem building. So the last tool that we have as foundational is our ecosystem scorecard. What we realize is that there's a lot of ways to look at and measure visible elements of an ecosystem, but there's not so many to think about what are those invisible things. And how do you sort of measure and think about the culture and the efficacy of the programs? And so we developed a scorecard. It's more of a perception-based assessment. But it tackles and looks at elements along 4 areas: the people, programs, networks, and narratives within an ecosystem. And you'll see within the scorecard, what we do is we have that's further broken down into subcategories that involve talent pipeline. We've got intersections and conversations. It talks about the networks that are required really to sort of make things work beyond organizational level. And we talk about the narratives piece. And this is about the identity of the ecosystem and how it is measuring and learning along the way. And you'll see just a sample here of some of the elements in one of our subcategories here. How am I doing on time, Greg?
So we've got about 7 minutes left, and it's up to you whether you want to take questions or
okay.
Continue the presentation.
Yeah, I'll continue and I'll wrap up here in a little bit. So lastly, you'll see our framework for relational funding. This has to do with thinking beyond cash, thinking beyond investment directly to entrepreneurs, but what are other kinds of capital that are important to feed an ecosystem? And so, this is that. As we get to from analyzing and reframing, we think about modeling this and how do we equip others to do it. And so one of the ways that Forward Cities does that is through thought leadership, like having conversations like this. We call that E3 Voices. It's also about, how do we help those communities that understand the need to change, but don't have the capacity to do that. And we provide custom solutions for them to do that. And then what we're most excited about is building a national community of practice later on this year. And that's going to entail, yes, a national digital platform, and hopefully we'll be in person quite a bit like this, or actually in person, but also some very distinct learning journeys for specific sets of people in the ecosystem that share a common goal or vision. And so as I wrap up, we'd just like to ask you one thing that you will take away from this session and think about putting into practice in your ecosystem, or something that resonated with you. And we'll just give like a couple seconds for folks to drop those things in. And then Greg, if you'll just be emerging maybe some potential questions, and we'll see how this goes.
Yeah, I'll answer. I'll give my answer to this question live, and it feeds into the first question from the audience. I thought it was really interesting from the previous survey you did that there's this gap in perceptions. Obviously everybody on this conference cares a lot about entrepreneurship. That's why they're here. Come at it from very different angles. But this notion that there's a gap between what the ecosystem provides versus what entrepreneurs need, right? And how do we think about getting to the point where we're actually providing the things that are needed to entrepreneurs? So one of the questions that came in was hi Fay, I'm the entrepreneurship librarian at UNC Chapel Hill. Go Heels.
Down the road from me. That's great.
Yeah, my public and academic library colleagues have an ongoing conversation about how we can support entrepreneurs and our communities and contribute to healthy and inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystems. What suggestions might you have for librarians to consider as we connect with our local ecosystems? How can ecosystem partners become aware of the services and support that we can offer?
Oh, it's a great question. And actually, libraries are one of the fantastic sets of folks that are tangential, but crucial to ecosystem. And we've experienced that in multiple cities. We work in Kansas City, and there's a great librarian that's been a part of our work there. They're really deeply involved in entrepreneurship. And one of the things they've done is activate a tool created by an organization called, a company called Legal GPS. They originally were doing legal digital platform to help entrepreneurs, and they partnered with us in our eShip Communities program to expand that to help entrepreneurs during COVID-19. But they also will design that does exist for the entrepreneurs in Kansas City. So you should definitely get in touch with them. But what we're seeing, and I have spoken for the National Library Association, I believe it is, but I think there has to be a direct engagement of those folks with ecosystem players. So if there's a group of people convening in your ecosystem, you want to be at that table.
Yep, that's great. So here's another one. So trust is a common thread weaving in every direction across this tapestry of 3E. Trust is speed, it's valuable as currency, it's power, it's affected by power and equity, et cetera. Any thoughts on parsing trust into its driving forces that confer trustworthiness or deliver the value of trust?
Yeah, so it's why I put in there authentic relationships, is that this is it. There's no quick fix, there's no workaround. It is around treating people as people, seeing them, hearing their authentic stories, and being willing to continue to have conversations. That's it. People, I think, want to make it harder than it is, but that's really where it all grounds down to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and maybe kind of a quick follow-up on that. Yeah, you had mentioned that you're now doing a partnership with SBA. Obviously the Kauffman Foundation, JP Morgan. I mean, in some ways, I think it's really interesting how you pulled together this kind of group of policy related, government policy related people, private industry people, and sort of folks I would think of as in sort of maybe more philanthropic approach to it. So that's a very in some ways powerful kind of coalition if you can get people in the right place. But I mean, how do you navigate the fact that maybe some people are distrustful of the government? Maybe some people feel like, that there's certain types of organizations, say a large bank, for example, that, maybe they haven't had great experiences with. How do you sort of take this broader group of people who are potentially willing to contribute and build trust with those organizations, not just between people? Yeah.
So I'll lean into that, and it actually I'll relate it to one of the threads that someone put on the Slido, and that is it says, I need to keep it simple. This approach seems overly complex as a way of controlling a very complex system. And so one of the things that's really important to understand is that natural ecosystems actually have natural blocks, right? And there are things that don't work in every natural ecosystem. And when you think about ecosystem building in general, it flows and it works naturally and easily for a lot of people in its complexity, right? But what for people of color and for women, those barriers that we discussed, if we don't have an intentional approach, this is a complex issue, so it's not going to have a simple fix. If we don't address this, then those barriers will continue and people will just keep doing what they're doing and we will be where we are. And so, yes, this is complex. Systems change, narrative change is very complex work. And that means we don't throw all of this out at an ecosystem or community at one time. I'm sharing with you a very truncated sort of quick view of something that actually this might take years, right? And there may be pieces of it. But it's about that trust. And so, like you said, different people, different sets of people in the ecosystem, and that's why we have that capital framework, is because they each have to hear a different message because they value different things, right? And so you have to have different conversations with different people. It's the same way marketers approach their work, which is they don't speak to all audiences and all people the same way. They target their message and they target the conversation to who needs to hear it. And then they can begin to think of things at a holistic level.
Yep. Well, Fay, that is a great place to leave it. Unfortunately, we didn't get to all of the questions that people have, but we're going to send the questions over to you and contact information. So hopefully you or someone else at Forward Cities will be able to get back to folks, because there were definitely a lot of questions that came in. But thank you again for being here. Fantastic and a presentation and fantastic perspective on something that's really fundamentally important to what we're trying to do at the university and I would say academia more broadly, but also in thinking about where we can provide additional opportunities for people through our individual ecosystems and networks.